Genius and madness are neighbors, but these guys were roommates. We are tracking down the 33 most unhinged moments in military history, where the men responsible for millions of lives were busy marrying chickens, declaring war on the weather, and unintentionally drinking dead people. Your view of great leaders is about to be ruined forever. 1. You probably know Prussian Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher as the intense military commander who saved the day at the Battle of Waterloo. But by the end of his life, his brain had completely left the building. As he got older, this legendary warrior developed a delusion so specific and absurd that it sounds like a hallucination from a bad fever dream. He was genuinely convinced that he had been impregnated by a French soldier and was about to give birth to a baby elephant. Imagine being his doctor, trying to have a serious conversation about his health while the most feared man in Prussia is screaming in panic because he thinks a trunk is about to pop out of him. He spent his final days terrified of this imaginary pachyderm delivery, proving that you can defeat Napoleon, but you cannot defeat your own insanity. 2. Losing an eye in medieval warfare is usually a sign that it is time to retire. But for the Czech general Jan Žižka, it was basically just a warm-up exercise. This guy started his military career with one working eye, which is already playing on hard mode, but eventually, he went completely blind in both eyes and just refused to quit. While most people would struggle to find their way to the breakfast table in the dark, Žižka was commanding thousands of troops in complex battles while staring into total pitch blackness. He relied entirely on the sounds of the clash and descriptions from his assistants to visualize the slaughter in his head. The most mind-blowing part is that even after going totally blind, he never lost a single battle, crushing the Holy Roman Empire repeatedly without ever seeing the enemy. 3. If there was a Hall of Fame for absolute incompetence, the Chinese warlord Zhang Zongchang, known as the Dog Meat General, would be the unanimous president. This man ran his province in the 1920s like a chaotic video game server, famously admitting he did not know 3 basic things: how much money he had, how many soldiers were in his army, or how many wives were in his harem. But his peak madness happened during a severe drought. When the skies finally opened up, the rain was so heavy it ruined his military plans, so Zhang did the only logical thing. He got offended. He dragged his artillery battery outside and ordered his men to fire their cannons directly at the sky to punish God for the bad weather. He literally declared war on the rain, proving that you do not need brains to have gunpowder. 4. Stonewall Jackson is remembered as a tactical genius of the American Civil War, but if you met him in person, you would think he was an alien trying to act human. If you saw him riding into the heat of battle, you would notice he almost always kept one arm raised high in the air, and it wasn't to wave at his friends. He genuinely believed that one side of his body was heavier than the other, and that he needed to keep his arm up to balance the blood so he wouldn't tip over like a broken bicycle. To make it even weirder, he was obsessed with lemons. He would ride through the carnage of combat, calmly sucking on lemons like they were pacifiers, totally ignoring the bullets flying past his head while worrying about his blood equilibrium. 5. World War II was the era of atomic bombs, tanks, and machine guns, but nobody told that to the British officer Mad Jack Churchill. He looked at modern technology, said, "No thanks," and decided to fight the Nazis using equipment from the Middle Ages. He stormed the beaches of Europe armed with a Scottish broadsword, a longbow, and a set of bagpipes, famously stating that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. And he wasn't just cosplaying. In 1940, he actually spotted a German sergeant and shot him dead with a longbow arrow, scoring the only confirmed medieval kill in a modern industrialized war. While everyone else was terrified of airstrikes, Mad Jack was playing Dungeons & Dragons in real life, and somehow, he survived the whole thing to complain that the war ended too soon. 6. Winfield Scott was a massive figure in American history, serving as a general from the War of 1812 all the way to the Civil War. But by the end, he was massive in a very literal sense. The general loved fine dining so much that he ballooned to a size where basic movement became a logistical nightmare. When the Civil War broke out, he was so incredibly large that he could no longer climb onto a horse like a normal human being. His staff had to construct a special winch system to physically hoist the commanding general of the United States Army onto his saddle, like they were loading a shipping container onto a boat. Nothing strikes fear into the enemy quite like watching your opponent being slowly craned into position before the battle even starts. 7. We all know that dictators love to steal money from their countries, but Spain's Francisco Franco decided to take getting lucky to a suspiciously high level. One year, the grand prize of the massive national lottery, El Gordo, was won by none other than the Generalissimo himself. Now ask yourself, what are the statistical odds of the country's absolute ruler fairly winning the biggest jackpot in the land? It is basically zero. It is widely believed that his henchmen either tracked down the real winner and took the ticket, or simply forced the lottery officials to announce that Franco's number was the winner, whether the balls matched or not. It is the ultimate flex of corruption. Why bother robbing a bank when you can just force luck itself to bow down to your dictatorship? 8. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered most of Europe, outsmarted emperors, and rewrote history. But his most embarrassing defeat did not come from the British or the Russians. It came from a horde of fluffy bunnies. To celebrate a treaty, his chief of staff organized a rabbit hunt and made the mistake of buying hundreds of tame, domesticated rabbits instead of wild ones. When the cages were opened, the rabbits didn't run away in fear. They thought Napoleon was the guy bringing them lettuce. The fluffy swarm charged the emperor, climbing up his legs and jacket in a relentless wave of hunger. The most powerful man on earth was forced to flee to his carriage, frantically fighting off hundreds of bunnies, proving that while you can defeat armies, you cannot defeat aggressive cuddling. 9. You might picture Georgy Zhukov as the stone-faced Soviet marshal who crushed the Nazis and captured Berlin. But secretly, he was addicted to the ultimate symbol of American capitalism, Coca-Cola. He fell in love with the sugary drink after meeting Eisenhower, but drinking imperialist soda in Stalin's Russia would have been a straight ticket to the gulag. So he made a request that sounds like an urban legend, but is 100% historical fact. He asked the Coca-Cola company to manufacture a special clandestine batch just for him that was completely clear and colorless. The chemists actually removed the caramel coloring and bottled the soda in straight bottles with a red star cap to make it look exactly like vodka. So, while everyone thought Zhukov was knocking back hard liquor like a tough Russian hero, he was secretly enjoying a fizzy sugar rush, literally smuggling his love for America inside a fake vodka bottle right under Stalin's nose. 10. General George Patton was one of the toughest and most aggressive commanders of World War II, but his internal life was operating on a level of weirdness that most people cannot comprehend. He was absolutely convinced that he wasn't just George Patton. He believed he was an eternal warrior soul who had been reincarnated in every major conflict in human history. He claimed with a straight face that he had fought alongside the Roman legions, marched with Napoleon's Grand Army, and battled in ancient Greece. He would frequently visit ancient ruins he had never seen before and start acting like a tour guide, claiming he knew exactly where the Roman camp was pitched because he had personally slept there 2,000 years ago. To him, World War II wasn't a new job. It was just the latest level in a video game he had been playing for centuries. 11. If you think modern dictators are scary, you haven't met Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, a man so terrifying he was literally known as the Mad Baron. During the Russian Civil War, this guy took his army to Mongolia and started a regime that felt less like a military campaign and more like a horror movie cult. He converted to Buddhism, but practiced a twisted, violent version of it, eventually convincing himself that he was the actual reincarnation of Genghis Khan, sent to cleanse the world. He ruled with absolute terror, consulting fortune tellers before battles and torturing his enemies in ways that would make a medieval executioner sick. He was basically a mythical monster who somehow wandered into the 20th century, and he fought with a brutality that made even his fellow hardened soldiers think he was possessed by demons. 12. Julius Caesar is arguably the most famous and powerful Roman of all time, a man who conquered Gaul and seduced Cleopatra. Yet he was mentally crippled by one massive insecurity. He was going bald. For a man who controlled the known world, losing his hair was the one battle he simply could not win, and it drove him crazy. He was so deeply embarrassed by his shiny dome that he essentially invented the comb-over, brushing his hair desperately forward to hide the receding line. But his favorite trick was the famous laurel wreath. History books tell us he wore it to symbolize his great victories and authority, but ancient historians claim he wore it 24/7, mainly because it worked as a fancy wig substitute. Essentially, the most iconic symbol of Roman imperial power was just a hat used to hide a bad hair day. 13. Robert E. Lee is almost always depicted as the stoic, marble-faced symbol of the Confederate Army. But behind the scenes, his best friend was a literal chicken. During the height of the Civil War, Lee kept a pet hen named Nellie, who lived in his tent and followed him around the camp like a loyal dog. This wasn't just livestock for dinner. She was his emotional support animal who laid fresh eggs under his cot every morning. The general adored this bird so much that when Nellie went missing during a chaotic retreat, Lee actually ground the army's operations to a halt to search for her. Imagine thousands of ragged soldiers waiting to march while their commanding general runs around the bushes calling for his favorite chicken. It is a weirdly wholesome and absurd detail in the middle of a brutal war. 14. Union General Benjamin Butler really hated the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And when he captured a city where Davis had lived, he decided to express that hatred through the most elaborate toilet humor in history. Butler ordered the manufacturing of expensive, custom-made china wash basins and urinals for the city's public use. But he included a very specific design request. He demanded that manufacturers plaster a portrait of Jefferson Davis's face right at the bottom of every single urinal and chamber pot. The goal was to ensure that every soldier and citizen would be forced to, well, pay their disrespects to the Confederate leader several times a day. It was a level of petty psychological warfare that cost a fortune, proving that even high-ranking generals are willing to spend big money for a good poop joke. 15. Pyrrhus of Epirus was one of the greatest military tacticians who ever lived, a man who terrified Rome and gave us the term Pyrrhic victory. You would expect a warrior of his legendary caliber to die in an epic duel or a massive explosion, but reality is often much stupider. He was taken out by a roof tile. During a chaotic street fight in the city of Argos, an elderly woman was watching the battle from her rooftop and saw Pyrrhus fighting her son in the street below. She grabbed a heavy ceramic roof tile and threw it with pinpoint accuracy, hitting the great general right on the neck and paralyzing him instantly. The man who battled empires and defied odds was ultimately defeated by an angry mom with some home renovation supplies, which has to be the most anticlimactic ending in ancient history. 16. Simon Bolivar is known as the Liberator, a colossal figure who freed huge chunks of South America from Spanish rule and had entire countries named after him. He controlled vast territories and immense wealth during his life, essentially ruling a continent. But when he finally died, the reality of his situation was shockingly tragic. He had spent, donated, or lost so much of his personal fortune fighting for his revolution that he died in absolute dirt-poor poverty. It got so bad that when his servants prepared his body for the funeral, they realized the great general didn't even own a decent shirt to be buried in. They had to frantically borrow a shirt from a neighbor just to dress the corpse of the man who founded nations. It is a brutal irony. He gave South America its freedom, but he couldn't even afford his own funeral clothes. 17. Union General Dan Sickles was a man who lived for drama, but his relationship with his own body parts was frankly disturbing. During the Battle of Gettysburg, his leg was shattered by a cannonball, which is a terrible tragedy for most people, but Sickles saw it as a marketing opportunity. After the amputation, he didn't just bury the limb like a normal person. He kept the shattered bones, had them preserved in a neat little coffin, and donated them to a medical museum in Washington. For the next 50 years of his life, he would regularly visit the museum on the anniversary of the amputation to hang out with his own leg bones. He would even bring friends along to introduce them to his former shin, proving that he was the only man in history to have a toxic long-distance relationship with himself. 18. Giuseppe Garibaldi is the legendary hero who united Italy. and his troops were famous for wearing iconic red shirts, symbolizing their fiery revolutionary spirit and willingness to bleed for the cause. Or at least, that is the romantic story historians like to tell. The reality is much more like a clearance sale at a thrift shop. Garibaldi didn't choose red for ideology. He chose it because he was broke. He found a massive shipment of red tunics in Argentina that were originally intended for butchers and slaughterhouses so the bloodstains wouldn't show. He bought them because they were incredibly cheap, not because they were stylish. So, the most famous fashion statement in Italian military history was actually just bargain bin butcher wear that nobody else wanted to buy. 19. Field Marshal. Lord Kitchener is the terrifying face of the British Empire, the guy with the giant mustache pointing at you from the famous "I want you" recruitment posters. He looks like he eats nails for breakfast, but his private hobby was surprisingly grandma-like. The iron-fisted general was absolutely obsessed with knitting. He didn't just do it to relax. He was a knitting evangelist who believed it was a vital military skill. He developed a specific, seamless pattern for socks, known as the Kitchener stitch, and aggressively encouraged his soldiers to knit their own comfortable footwear to prevent trench foot. It is a hilarious mental image. The most intimidating man in England sitting by the fire, needles clicking away, aggressively purling a pair of cozy wool booties while planning the destruction of his enemies. 20. King Frederick William Narn of Prussia, known as the Soldier King, had a fetish for tall men that went way beyond military strategy. He was obsessed with creating a regiment called the Potsdam Giants, where the only requirement to join was being over 6 feet tall. He didn't care if they were good soldiers, he just wanted to collect them like rare action figures. He spent a fortune buying tall men from other countries, trading priceless artifacts for them, and even kidnapping giants from foreign lands to drag them into his army. He even tried to force tall soldiers to marry tall women in a weird eugenics experiment to breed giant babies. The funniest part? He loved them so much he refused to let them fight in actual battles because he didn't want to scratch his collectibles. 21. Mithridates VI, the king of Pontus, was so paranoid about being assassinated that he turned his own body into a science experiment. He spent his entire life taking tiny, non-lethal doses of every known poison to build up a natural immunity, a practice now known as Mithridatism. He thought he was a genius until the day he actually lost a war and needed to commit suicide to avoid capture by the Romans. He chugged a massive dose of poison, expecting a quick death, but nothing happened. His body was so incredibly tolerant that the poison had zero effect. He was literally suffering from success. In a tragic comedy of errors, he had to awkwardly ask his own bodyguard to draw a sword and stab him because he had accidentally made himself unkillable by chemical means. 22. Antonio López de Santa Anna, the Mexican general and dictator, had an ego so massive it probably had its own gravitational pull. During a battle against the French, he lost his leg to cannon fire, which is unfortunate, but what he did next is pure narcissism. Years later, he decided that his lost leg hadn't received the respect it deserved. He had the shriveled, decaying limb dug up and arranged a full-state funeral for it. We are talking about a magnificent procession, cannon salutes, prayers, and military honors, all for a rotting ankle and foot. He forced the nation to mourn his amputated body part as if it were a fallen hero, proving that for a dictator, even their trash is considered a national treasure. 23. British Field Marshal Douglas Haig was the man responsible for sending millions of men to their deaths in the mud of World War I, projecting an image of stiff upper lip rationality. But behind closed doors, his strategy meetings were a lot more supernatural. Haig was deeply into spiritualism and regularly attended seances to communicate with the dead. He genuinely believed that he was receiving military advice from the ghosts of former commanders, specifically Napoleon Bonaparte. Imagine being a soldier in the trenches realizing that your orders aren't coming from intelligence reports, but from a Ouija board session where your boss is asking a dead French guy how to beat the Germans. It gives a whole new, terrifying meaning to the phrase, ghosting your responsibilities. 24. Ulysses S. Grant was the hard-drinking, cigar-chomping general who ground the Confederate Army into dust and earned the nickname the Butcher for his tolerance of high casualties. But in his personal life, the Butcher was terrified of his own nickname. Grant had a severe phobia of blood. He couldn't stand the sight of it on a dinner plate. If a steak arrived at his table with even a hint of pink or red juice, he would become physically nauseous and refuse to eat it. He insisted that all his meat be cooked until it was basically charcoal, burnt to a crisp. It is a fascinating psychological paradox. The man who could look out over a battlefield of thousands of dead bodies without blinking would faint if his burger wasn't well done. 25. Subutai is widely considered the greatest military strategist of the Mongol Empire, the man who actually directed the armies for Genghis Khan. But physically, he was the opposite of a nimble warrior. By the end of his career, Subutai had become so incredibly obese that he physically could not ride a horse anymore. While his armies were famous for their lightning-fast speed and mobility, their supreme commander had to be hauled around the battlefield in a reinforced iron wagon, or a carriage pulled by multiple horses because gravity had become his biggest enemy. Yet, despite being unable to walk or ride, he directed 65 pitched battles and conquered more territory than any other commander in history. He essentially destroyed the armies of Europe and Russia while sitting in a medieval wheelchair, proving that you don't need cardio to conquer the world. 26. Alexander Suvorov is the legendary Russian general who never lost a single battle in his entire career. But if you met him, you would assume he was an escaped mental patient. He despised luxury and refused to sleep in a bed, preferring to curl up on a bundle of hay like a farm animal, even when staying in palaces. But his morning routine was the real nightmare for his soldiers. He didn't use bugles or drums to wake up his troops. He did it himself. The generalissimo of the Russian Empire would run around the camp at dawn, flapping his arms and crowing at the top of his lungs like a rooster. Imagine being a groggy soldier trying to salute your commander, while he is literally clucking and screaming cock-a-doodle-doo in your face. It was pure madness, but hey, it worked. 27. If you looked up the word unkillable in the dictionary, you would find a picture of British General Adrian Carton de Wyatt. This man turned World War I and II into his personal action movie. Over the course of his career, he was shot in the face, head, stomach, ankle, leg, hip, and ear. He survived 2 plane crashes, tunneled out of a POW camp, and bit off his own fingers when a doctor refused to amputate them. He walked around with 1 eye, 1 hand, and more scars than skin. And after all that horror, when asked about his experience, he calmly told reporters, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." He is the only human being in history who treated global conflict like a fun weekend hobby, making the Terminator look like a fragile pacifist. 28. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte has one of the wildest career arcs in history. He started as a revolutionary French soldier fighting to destroy the monarchy and ended up being elected the King of Sweden. But he carried a very awkward secret to his grave. Legend has it that he was terrified of undressing in front of doctors or servants. When he finally died and they stripped his body, they supposedly found a large, faded tattoo on his chest from his wild revolutionary youth. It read, "Death to Kings." You have to appreciate the sheer irony of a man sitting on a throne, wearing a crown and royal robes, while his own skin is literally calling for his execution. He was the ultimate hypocrite, hiding his rebellious punk rock phase under a royal sash for decades. 29. Benedict Arnold is the most famous traitor in American history, a name synonymous with betrayal, but the United States Army still found a way to honor him without actually naming him. At the Saratoga National Historical Park, there is a bizarre monument known as the Boot Monument. It is a stone carving of a boot and a leg, dedicated to the brilliant general who was wounded there in 1777. But here is the catch. The monument doesn't mention Benedict Arnold's name anywhere. It lists his rank and his injury, but leaves the identity blank. It is the most passive-aggressive statue in existence, basically saying, "We really liked your leg and your tactical skills, but the rest of you was absolute garbage, so we are just going to honor the ankle." 30. The ancient Chinese warlord Cao Cao was a stickler for